Hello, everyone. Welcome to our week 3 video as we continue our tour through public organization theory literature. And this week brings us to a discussion of School of Administrative Management. We'll also talk about the beginnings of human relations theory, and then draw some contrast between these theories that we're going to talk about this week in comparison to some of the theories we talked about in preceding weeks, such as the classical School of Organization theory. So let's start off with a discussion of the School of Administrative Management and how that then transitioned into what became known as the Principal School. So the first gentleman we'll start with is Henri Fayol. And you've read Fayol's article, so you're somewhat familiar with Fayol. I'm sure you were exposed to it in your introductory course, and now you get to read it again in this course in organization theory. Fayol is best known for distinguishing governing of organizations as being something different than just management. And basically what Fayol tells us is that governing an organization is kind of an umbrella term. And when you govern an organization, you engage in several discrete, different types of activities. And so according to Fayol, when you govern an organization, governing an organization consists of 6 different activities. There are managerial activities. And when you engage in management, you are clearly allocating and reallocating and distributing resources for specific types of purposes. So in your managerial activities, you are managing or distributing, allocating resources. Also, when you govern an organization, you're also engaged in what are called technical activities. And so technical activities really get at the heart of what you do on a daily basis in the organization and how you go about doing the daily jobs of the organization. Your third set of activities are financial activities. You have to manage budgets. You have to manage resources that flow into and out of your organization. You engage in commercial activities in terms of these transactional relationships that you then have with other agencies and other entities outside of your organization. You engage in security activities. You secure your information. You secure your resources. You secure the safety of your employees within your organization. And then your 6th category of activities, accounting activities. You then have to account for how you engage in spending your resources and managing all of your funds. So according to Fayol, those 6 activities are all part and parcel of the process of the overall governance of an organization. And so it's kind of an interesting concept that he really does separate out governance and management. Management is just one activity that you engage in the overall governance of your organization. He then takes those 6 different activities and he connects them to managerial functions. And so he says, in order to engage in these activities, there are certain functions that all managers do in engaging in those 6 activities. And those managerial functions, according to Fayol, are things like planning. We have to set goals and objectives for our organization and plan for our organization's future. Organizing, we have to organize all the different resources and all the different activities within our organization to, again, make sure that all these activities are working together to contribute to our ultimate goals and objectives that we establish in our planning function. The third function is commanding. We have to, as leaders and managers, command what types of activities need to occur within our organization. We have to coordinate all these activities to, again, make sure that all activities are working together to achieve our ultimate goals. And control. We have to control the resources as they flow through our organization, control the personnel who work in our organization, and control the activities that go on within our organization as well. So what Fayol then did is he created for us 14 different principles of governing an organization. And we won't go through all of those principles. I think you'll see them. I believe it's on, I forget the page number, but it's all there in chapter 6 for you, where he presents you with a table whereby you can see all 14 of these discrete types of principles, things like an esprit de corps, and again, a whole list of principles that managers then adhere to. But again, the importance with Fayol is that Fayol is emphasizing to us the idea of governing the organization, and how all these different managerial things that we do and all these ways in which we handle our resources and secure the safety of our employees, those are just activities that all occur within this governance function of governing the organization. FAIL really kind of focus on a psychological and organizational type of lens in which he viewed everything within. Mooney takes on a little bit more of an organizational as compared to psychological approach. And Mooney takes a lot of what FAIL does and crystallizes that into what's referred to as his principles of organizations. So he says we can take all this and we can crystallize it into three basic principles of organizations. One is the coordinative principle. So the coordinative principle obviously is back to that coordination type of activity from FAIL. The coordinative principle means that all leaders and managers must coordinate the activities within their organizations. The scalar chain principle, meaning that there is a unity of command and there is a scalar chain by which everyone knows to whom they are responsible. And so you have this nice organizational chart a la a Max Weber and ideal bureaucratic theory. And then the third principle, and this is a real contribution that Mooney made to the literature and our understanding of public organizations, is his functional principle. In his functional principle, he then distinguishes for us two different types of employees. There are line employees and there are staff employees. And as leaders and managers, we need to manage line employees differently than staff employees. A line employee is an employee that is interfacing on a daily basis with citizens. This is, again, what Michael Lipsky will refer to as a street-level bureaucrat. They're a street-level bureaucrat because they are interfacing daily with the beneficiaries, the consumers, the citizens that benefit from the programs that we are creating as an organization. Then you have a category of employees called staff employees. Staff employees do not necessarily interface with citizens, but rather they provide the resources necessary to allow the line employees to engage in that interface. So they're the ones who are providing the support, the administrative support, and the resources. That distinction between line employees and staff employees is important because we will manage those employees differently depending upon what category they fall within. So it's adding an additional level of nuance and sophistication to how we manage our organizations. And so that's really one of the major things Mooney is remembered for, is this functional principle distinguishing between line and staff types of employees. But what FAIL and Mooney do is they set the stage for us in terms of creating different principles of management that then end up getting crystallized into what's called the principal school by a gentleman by the name of Luther Gulick. Now, Luther Gulick is a bit different than a lot of the authors we have talked about up to this point in time, in that Gulick not only presents us with these theoretical perspectives, but Gulick actually applied those perspectives to the federal government, to the federal bureaucracy. Gulick, through his work on the Brownlow Commission back in the 1930s, came up with a complete reorganization and redesign of the entire federal government. In the 1930s, we had the FDR administration, and FDR's administration was trying to respond to the problems associated with the Great Depression. We had the stock market crash in the late 1920s. We had the ensuing Great Depression. FDR comes into the White House with the goal of trying to help state and local governments recover from that Great Depression. As we all know, he did that through his New Deal programs. New Deal programs created all these new federal programs and all these new federal agencies. Well, when you create all these federal agencies and you create this myriad of programs, you are greatly expanding the size, the scope, and the sophistication of the federal bureaucracy. When you expand the federal bureaucracy to that degree, it makes it very difficult for one person, for a president, to be in charge of that ever-growing, enlarging federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission, their primary goal was to try and reorganize this federal bureaucracy to make it easier to manage. And so some of the artifacts we got from the Brownlow Commission, things like the creation of the Executive Office of the President, which is still with us today. And within that Executive Office of the President, they then house a lot of these management or overhead types of agencies. Well, Luther Gulick was part of the Brownlow Commission, actually chaired it for a period of time. And in reorganizing the federal bureaucracy, he brought with him his principal school of management and applied it to the federal government. So he's not just talking about these things from a theoretical, esoteric type of level. He's actually finding that nexus by bringing his theories into practice in the federal government. So Luther Gulick in his principal school presents us with what is essentially a managerial toolkit, where he says, if we can provide our managers with this toolkit of principles, we can then allow them to use these principles when they see appropriate. You're basically kind of, like if you're a plumber and you take your toolkit in there, you've got a wrench and you've got all these different tools, and you pull those tools out and use them as appropriate in fixing your plumbing. Well, managers do the same thing. They have this toolkit. They can then pull the required tool out at the correct point in time. So in this managerial toolkit, it consists of all these different principles of management that managers need to be aware of and be familiar with. Oftentimes, this principal school, you've seen it before as POSCORB, that acronym that stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. All managers plan. All managers have to organize activities. All managers have to staff their organizations to bring the quote unquote right people with the right skill sets into positions within the organization. Have to allocate work through that staffing function as well. You have to direct work and tell people what to do and how they are supposed to do it. You have to coordinate their activities. You have to have a reporting mechanism in place to report on what your organization is doing. And then you also engage in the principle of budgeting, whereby you manage the inflow and outflow of resources into and out of your organization. So Gulick really believed that if you provide these principles, this toolkit of principles to your managers, then you can make your managers more effective and more efficient. One of the problems with the principal school is that it had its critics. And two of the primary critics of the principal school are Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo, two very well-known individuals in the field of public administration. Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo's primary criticism revolved around the idea that these principles, as Gulick called them, were really not principles. They were more like proverbs, in that you can all, like with a proverb, you can find one proverb to maybe counteract another proverb. Well, it's the same type of thing with these principles. You can usually find one principle that will counteract and offset another principle, and that they are sometimes mutually exclusive when you combine them together. And so they really felt that this principal school of Gulick was a value-laden approach by which people like Gulick were able to justify why they were exploiting workers, and that it was kind of a subterfuge for them exploiting workers to try and extract the contributions they need from workers to benefit the organization. So he said, this really isn't a science of administration. This is more of a value-laden type of process. So not everyone extolled the virtues of the principal school. But what the principal school and people like Fayol and Mooney and Gulick, what they hold in common with the classical theorists like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor is that they were all searching for the one-size-fits-all approach. They were all searching for the one magic bullet that could be used in every single situation to make organizations and managers efficient and effective. For Weber, it was structure. For Taylor, it was the work process. For Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick, it's this idea of coming up with the principles that are universal principles that we can teach our managers to then use those principles to be efficient and to be effective. So it's that one size fits all search for a panacea that really ties the principal school together pretty nicely with the classic school of organization theory. So what does Tompkins tell us about this principal school in terms of those 4 models of organizational effectiveness that we are using in this class to tie all of our theories and schools of thought together? Well, for the principal school tends to highlight 2 of those 4 models of organizational effectiveness. They define effectiveness through the internal process model, and they define it through the rational goal model. The focus is really on how you manage employees and resources within the organization, so very much the internal type of focus, and also a focus on trying to achieve the goals of the organization to make the organization as effective and efficient as possible. But when you hearken back to that Quinn and Rohrbach matrix that we used at the very start of the class and that we're using every week, you've got your 4 different models there in that 4-cell matrix. We are looking at internal process and rational goal models, which are at the bottom of the matrix, meaning that they are favoring control over flexibility. So it still is a very top-down type of way of organizing your organization and managing the work of your employees. Since it is a top-down type of an approach, the principal school certainly does favor direct supervision as the primary mechanism for the control and coordination of work. Again, very top-down type of orientation. And in terms of our motivational strategies, legal compliance above all else, holding people accountable for their actions with these punitive types of measures. So this very centralized top-down type of an approach to running our organizations, that's what we see under this principal school. Again, very similar to what we saw under the classical school of organization theory. We do start to go through a transition period, though, where we start transitioning more into another school of thought, which is known as the human relations school. And the person who takes us through that gradual transition is someone by the name of Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett, who was writing primarily in the 1920s, is one of my favorite authors. And I like Follett a lot because she was one of the only people in the 1920s to stand up and cite some of the problems with scientific management. So in the 1920s, when scientific management was being bought into across the federal government, across public organizations, she was kind of the lone voice in the wilderness who was willing to stand up and say, there are some problems with scientific management. Scientific management has some flaws. One of the major flaws of scientific management, according to Follett, is it was just so dehumanizing. It dehumanizes individual employees. It really doesn't value employee participation. It doesn't really allow employees to participate in their own governance. But not only were there these flaws with Frederick Taylor's scientific management, but she also said that there are also flaws in our democratic system of government. And so what Follett basically does is she shifts our perspective. So she commends us to start looking at organizations from a democratic perspective, to view them as democratic types of institutions. Well, if you're going to view your organization as a democratic institution, that means that your organization is probably going to suffer from a lot of the same problems that a democratic form of government will suffer from. Follett says democratic forms of government, democracies, suffer from 2 basic fundamental flaws. One problem with a democracy is what she calls the particularized interest of citizens. This is what James Madison talked to us about in Federalist number 10 when he talked about factions. If you remember back to maybe your introductory course or even farther back into your undergraduate training with your American government courses, you probably read the Federalist Papers. And if you read any of the Federalist Papers, I can pretty much guarantee you read Federalist number 10. This is one of the most famous of the 85 Federalist Papers. But at number 10, Madison cautions us about how democracies create factions. And then says, well, what do we do about those factions? These particularized interests, as Follett calls them. We can either try and eliminate factions, but if you eliminate factions, you are eliminating democracy, because factions are a necessary outgrowth of a democracy and a compound republic. So if you can't get rid of factions, the best thing you can do, according to Madison, is to control their effects. And you control their effects by balancing faction against faction, particularized interest against particularized interest. Another problem that Follett saw in a democratic form of government is what she called passivity among citizens. Democracies tend to create passive citizens. Now, ostensibly in a democratic form of government, that democracy will create all these different avenues for people to participate in their own self-governance. The problem is people tend not to take advantage of all those different avenues. So in a democracy, there's a lot of different ways in which you can participate in your own governance. You can vote, you can donate money to candidates, you could run for office yourself, you could volunteer for campaigns, you can talk about politics. There are a lot of different ways to participate. The way that most Americans participate, if they even do participate, is simply through voting, the most passive of all of those types of strategies. So she likes democracies. She thinks that democracy is a fine form of government, but she points out to us they create passive citizens, and democracies also create these factions, these particularized interests. Well, what's the problem with having particularized interests? The problem with having particularized interests is that it causes conflict, because one faction will come into conflict with another faction. So conflict, according to Follett, is inherent within democracies. So what do we do about fixing some of those flaws, and how do we deal with this inherent conflict? Well, she argues there are three basic ways to deal with conflict between particularized interests. One way is through domination, where one faction will dominate the other faction. So one faction wins, one faction loses. She argues that that is the least attractive option for dealing with conflict, because someone's always going to lose. So those people who lose, that particularized interest group that loses, will not buy into the final decision, because they will feel that their opinions aren't being valued and aren't being included in the decision-making process. So you're going to inherently lose some people in trying to move forward as a government or as an organization. So she says domination is not the best way or the most appropriate way to deal with conflict. So the second alternative for dealing with conflict is compromise and negotiation. So the particularized interests, the two groups get together and each group gives up something. So I'll give up a little, you give up a little, and we'll come to an agreement, we'll come to a compromise. She argues that compromise and negotiated settlement is better than domination, but it's still not ideal, because we're both giving something up, so we're both going to be disappointed in the process. She says the best way to deal with conflict is through this third approach known as integration. In integration, we allow for what she calls an interpenetration of ideas. It's kind of what Theodore Lowy referred to a democracy as when he said a democracy is a true marketplace of ideas. But when democracies are healthy and they're operating appropriately, they really serve as this marketplace whereby ideas can be passed back and forth and ideas can be shared. When ideas are shared, you then end up with an interpenetration of ideas. So you'll share your opinion with me. I may have never thought of that before. I may have never thought of approaching that issue like that before, but now I start to think about it. And then maybe my opinions start to interpenetrate into your way of thinking as well. And through this exchange of ideas and this interpenetration, you end up with an integration of ideas. So the ideas all get integrated and assimilated together to come up with a new and different way of approaching a problem that all the parties, all the factions can get behind. So she thinks that we should deal with conflict in our organizations through this process known as interpenetration and integration of ideas. Well, in order to integrate ideas, you need to have a system of communication, but you also need to have people who are empowered within the organization. So Follett then turns her attention to the idea of power within organizations and who has the power and how power flows in organizations. She argues that in scientific management and some of those classical organization theories, it was what she called a power over relationship, where leaders in the organization exercise power over their subordinates. She argues that it should not be a power over relationship, but rather it should be a power with relationship. And instead of leaders giving power to their subordinates, leaders have an obligation to help their subordinates develop power as a resource. So develop their own repository of power. She argues that power is a resource that is to be developed and not a resource to be given. So if you are going to help your employees develop their own power and develop their own resources, inherently it means that you are going to have a good system of participation and communication within your organization. For her principles of organization, she really emphasized coordination and integration between departments and individuals. That you need to have a free flow of communication vertically and horizontally in your organization to allow for this coordination of ideas and to allow for this integration of ideas to occur. That participation must begin very early with your organization and very early when people enter into the organization. When they enter the organization, they need to understand that they are free to express their opinions. They are free to participate in this free flow of communication within the organization. In this participation and this free flow of communication, you need to take into account all perspectives, so that there's no perspective that's out of bounds. There's nothing we're going to say, well, we're not even going to consider that. You need to be able to be open to all these different perspectives that people are bringing into the conversation. And this coordination, this communication is dynamic in nature, in that it's going to change. As people change in your organization, the nature of how they communicate will change. As the organization ages, as people go through a maturation process, that type of communication is going to be dynamic and change as well. So Mary Parker Follett's approach to running democratic organizations, as you can see, is much different than what we see in the classical school. Here it's not as top-down. Here it's much more bottom-up in terms of allowing people to participate in their own governance and their own self-determination. Now, admittedly, the criticism to Mary Parker Follett is that sometimes it's not that realistic, and that we just can't do this in our organizations that are facing challenges from their environment and oftentimes have to act and react very, very quickly. In terms of the models of organizational effectiveness, Mary Parker Follett is kind of a pre-human relations theorist, really emphasizes 3 of our 4 models of organizational effectiveness. She emphasizes rational goal, internal process, and human relations. So there is some flexibility that's now for the first time really being built in to these theories. We didn't see that flexibility with the classical school. Now we're starting to see this emphasis placed upon the flexibility and latitude being given to employees to participate and engage in their own self-determination. Primary mechanism for control is mutual adjustment. So instead of the top-down direct supervision, now it's mutual adjustment, meaning that we will talk to our employees, we will listen to our employees, we will take their opinions into account in terms of determining how the work will be done on a daily basis. Motivational strategies, considerate leadership. Again, we're listening to our employees, and by listening to our employees and valuing their opinions, we are motivating them. So it's inherently a motivational strategy as well. We accept that people work in groups and that informal groups will exist within our organizations. And we embrace the idea of people working together in groups. And job identification. We let people build their jobs so that their jobs appeal to them. So if they want to develop their skills in a certain area, we will allow them to design their job duties to help them develop those skills. So think about in case of a situation where you may want to be a city manager one day. You may want to design your job so that you can do some cross functionality, whereby you may be able to work in for a period of time with the Parks Department, or a period of time with the Public Works Department, for a period of time with Public Safety, so that you can gain knowledge and skills in all those areas to help you develop to, in the future, hopefully, rise to the position of a city manager. That will allow you to better identify with the job that you are doing, and that will motivate you more to being productive and working harder than if you did not identify with the job you do on a daily basis. But again, the important thing about Mary Parker Fall is a lot of people, including Tompkins in his textbook, will consider her to be a pre-human relations theorist. And they call her a pre-human relations theorist just based upon when she was doing her writing. Since she was doing her writing in the 1920s, a lot of her ideas, she was writing 10, 20, 30 years before your more traditional human relations theorists got around to it. So I think she really was a pioneer and kind of just chronologically predated some of our human relations theorists, like people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and others. So Follett is a really nice transition to move us away from the classical and principle school and move us more into this new school of thought known as the School of Human Relations. Even though Follett was doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this in the 1920s, really when we get into the real human relations school, we're usually talking more of 30s, 40s into the 1950s. And one of the prominent theorists in the human relations school is Elton Mayo. And you've probably heard about Elton Mayo, and you may have read Elton Mayo before. Mayo approaches all this from kind of a psychological type of perspective. And he had what he called his social disorganization and human irrationality theories. Mayo believed that there was social disorganization, and that social disorganization was coming from two sources. One source was what he called human irrationality, and the other source was the factory system. Human irrationality. According to Mayo, because of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people, especially in more rural areas of the South, were moving away from their farms. They were moving away from their families at a relatively young age. They were moving away at 15, 16, 17 years old and moving north to these urban centers to get jobs in factories. And well, when they did that, because they were moving away at such a young age, they had these unresolved psychological conflicts that they were not able to deal with within their family unit because they were being pulled away to go live on their own and work in these northern cities and steel mills and factories and things such as that. So those unresolved psychological issues he referred to as one of the reasons why people tended to be acting irrationally within organizations. He also said people act irrationally in organizations because of the mere factory system itself and the way in which factories would work. Factories utilize this, what we call long-linked technology, whereby when you look at an assembly line, you will see that the person's job is dependent upon the person in front of them on the assembly line. And that person's job is dependent upon the person before them on the assembly line. And so that factory system didn't really allow people a lot of opportunities to be innovative and creative and to really develop their skills as human resources. So it's kind of this combination of psychological factors along with the factory system itself that is creating what he called human irrationality. So what Mayo wanted to do is he wanted to, from a psychological perspective, understand why people behave the way in which they did in organizations so that you could hopefully predict how they would react in certain situations and then enhance their productivity and their efficiency. So he did a wide variety of studies as a social scientist: illumination studies, relay assembly test room studies, jury studies. The one study that we really tend to focus on in public administration is his studies that he did at the Hawthorne electric plant. And if you're not familiar with the Hawthorne electric plant, what happened is he and his colleagues went into this electric plant and they wanted to study the impact of physical stimuli on the productivity of employees. And so the stimulus that he focused on was changing the lighting level, the illumination within the plant. So he comes up as a good social scientist with a thesis, with a hypothesis. And his hypothesis is, as we turn the lighting level up, people will be able to see better and they'll become more productive. So he turns up the lighting level and lo and behold, people become more productive. It confirms his hypothesis. So he checks that one off. Then he comes up with a second hypothesis. Well, then logically, if we turn the lighting level down, people won't be able to see as well and they'll become less productive. So he turns the lighting level down, productivity levels continue to go up. This confirms his hypothesis. So the question then becomes, well, why? The reason why is that people were reacting to the fact that they were being watched. And that's come to be known as in research as the Hawthorne effect. That when you observe someone, when you watch someone, they're going to behave differently than if they don't think that they are being watched. So the Hawthorne effect was, we're studying these people, we're asking them questions, we're paying attention to them, and they're reacting positively to us paying attention to them. It wasn't the physical stimulus of changing the lighting level, it was the social stimulation of us paying attention to these folks that was making them work harder and becoming more productive. He really started to recognize the importance of the informal aspects of organizations. He also recognized that there were group dynamics that were going on in the organization as well. That he placed people into groups and he would watch how those groups would behave. And what he would see is if there was a member of the group that was not pulling their weight, they were not being as productive as the other members of the group would start putting pressure on that person to become more productive. And those types of group dynamics, that type of informal pressure outside of the normal organizational chart, was really creating this situation to motivate people and to make people more productive. So Mayo's primary contribution for us is the contribution of viewing organizations as social systems populated by people who are social animals, who have these psychological needs, these needs for belonging, these needs of being respected by others. There was this social dimension to organizations, a social dimension that was, for the most part, ignored by the classical theorists like Weber and Taylor, as well as by the principles theorists like Gulick and Mooney. So what does Mayo contribute? He contributes this idea of viewing organizations as social structures and social environments that are populated by human beings who sometimes are irrational and sometimes do things that run counter to their perceived self-interest. The way in which we define organizational effectiveness in a Mayo motto is going to be the human relations model of organizational effectiveness. Clearly, we're squarely within that human relations model in that we are studying our individual employees within our organization, but we're trying to appeal to their psychological needs. And so it emphasizes a lot more flexibility than what we had with our more classical models of organizational effectiveness. There's still direct supervision in that we are watching people, we're listening to people. They're not still necessarily participating in their own self-governance like we will see in some later schools of thought. So still emphasis kind of that top-down direct supervision, because our primary goal by watching people and listening to them is to motivate them to work harder. And we want to motivate them to work harder to better help the organization achieve its goals. The motivational strategies under a Mayo type of human relations approach, considerate leadership, because again, we're talking and listening to employees and paying attention to employees, and group acceptance, realizing these informal groups are oftentimes just as important in deciding how productive the organization is as the formal organizational chart itself. So Mayo and this idea of human relations theory is a kinder and gentler way of running our organizations, where we actually do talk to employees, we actually do pay attention to employees, but we're doing it for a reason. And the reason is still this top-down expectation. By treating our employees like this and by paying attention to them, we can motivate them to work harder for the organization. And as I say, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is achieving the goals of the organization, making the organization more productive, more efficient, and more effective, not necessarily trying to help the individual employee achieve their individual goals. So criticisms of the human relations theory will say that the human relations theory and people like Mayo were exploitative, in that they were paying attention to people and talking to people just to try and get something out of those people, rather than trying to contribute to their growth as individuals. So again, this very brief discussion has taken us, kind of transitioned us away from the classical school and into this newer school, this neoclassical school known as human relations theory. It is a kinder and gentler way of managing our organizations, where we take into account our individual employees, but we are still doing it to try and achieve organizational goals as compared to helping human beings achieve their own individualized goals. But it again is a step in the way, along the way of the development of the organization theory literature, and it's a step towards some more neoclassical theories we'll talk about next week that will get us more into theories like human resource management, systems theories, and some of our more modern theories of public organizations. Okay, now let's turn our attention to some of the assignments that you'll be doing in the course here in week number 3. One thing that we are asking you to do here in week 3 is to, if you are not already familiar with Zoom, we really want you to get familiar with the Zoom technology. We know throughout this entire pandemic that Zoom has become kind of the go-to program for a lot of folks. And so I think it's useful. A lot of governments are using Zoom for their meetings. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, it's important that you become familiar with Zoom. So in your week 3 Zoom discussion board, we're asking you that you sign up for a free Zoom account. If you don't already have one, sign up for a Zoom account. They are free. The basic account will be free for you. And then use that free Zoom account to meet with at least one other classmate, one other person in a Zoom room for at least 2 minutes. So you'll set up a Zoom account, create a Zoom room, invite colleagues to meet you in that Zoom room, and you have to meet with at least one other classmate for this assignment. In that Zoom room, you can chat about anything that you want. It's completely up to you. But if you meet in that Zoom room for at least 2 minutes, chat about whatever you would like, then when you're done with your Zoom meeting, then create a post in discussion board where you address the following questions. What day and time did you meet? Who was in the Zoom room with you? What did you discuss? And then what are some situations where you have used Zoom in the past? So if you use it in the past for other courses, for work, for community groups, for personal, family types of meetings, just any previous experience you've had using Zoom. So that's your first discussion board assignment, getting you used to Zoom if you have not used it yet. Then your second discussion board assignment focuses on some of these neoclassical theories. So to prepare for the assignment, read all the assigned articles in the classics book, watch the videos that have been posted for you here in week 3, read the assigned chapters in the Tompkins textbook. You'll be doing chapters 6, 7, and 8 that identify 2 themes that run through the textbook and the articles in the classics book. So it could be something like efficiency or motivation. But identify 2 of those themes, and then locate a minimum of 1 additional academic peer-reviewed journal article that builds on each one of the original concepts. So in other words, you'll be doing 2 journal articles, 1 peer-reviewed journal article on each of the 2 themes that you have selected as the focus of your discussion board post. Combine your sources, the articles, Shafritz, which is the classic book, and Tompkins, and several theorists together to form a discussion about the topic that you select. Each topic should have several theories or theorists woven through the discussion. So if you're going to talk motivation, then craft a discussion where you tell us what Mayo says about motivation, or what the classical theorists say about motivation, or what the principal school says about motivation. You'll develop this discussion into a narrated PowerPoint presentation, as you are familiar with doing, you've done in the past. Post that and then respond to the posts of 2 other classmates. Then you have a journal entry for this week. And again, you've become familiar with the expectations with the journal entries, but it's a time for you to reflect on the vision you have for your task force. So you view the information on how to create a task force using the web link provided in the week's learning activities. You can write this in first-person language. That's acceptable for this type of a journal entry. But what I'm hoping you do in the journal is that you will explore your ideas for the task force that you would like to create. Answering questions such as, which agency department will lead the task force? What will the mission or purpose of the task force be? Which agencies or departments will be a part of your task force? What are the specific tasks that you need to accomplish or complete to set up the task force? So will you need MOUs, articulation agreements? What types of things will you need to do before the task force can come to fruition? How many people will be involved, and what types of expertise will people need to have to participate in the creation of this new task force? And then what will each member of the task force do? So the approach should be 250 to 500 words, but again, you are basically building out some of the foundational elements of this task force that you want to create. This is, again, a scaffolding type of an approach where you're using these journal entries, you're using your weekly assignments to then help you build your critical assignment, which is the creation of this task force. So you've got the Zoom room discussion, you have your other discussion, pulling out 2 main elements or themes from the readings for this week, and then you've got this journal entry in terms of answering these questions about the foundational aspects of creating your task force. So those are the assignments, and that's the information for this week. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I wish everyone a really good week, and we will talk again next week with our week 4 video. So have a great week and take care.